yeah, just a little bit of a background there before we start. So some session objectives for this evening. So just going to briefly explore early versus late specialization in the endurance event group, and just maybe some of the challenges around that. We want to look then at who is an event group athlete, so who are we actually going to be talking about this evening, so setting the scene. What qualities then do we want to develop in a junior endurance athlete and why? And then how can we influence retention in our event group? So that's kind of what pretty much we're going to try and go through tonight. It's quite a lot to fit in, but I'll try and give you a broad overview, like I said, of these fundamentals. Okay, so first point I was going to start off with was this early versus late specialization in endurance athletes. So I think the key thing to say in this is there's kind of not one way, and there's lots of examples of endurance athletes who specialize early within the sport, but potentially athletes who've you know, specialized later, so maybe even in adulthood, and have gone on to have quite good endurance careers. I think the key thing for me though is this early specialization. When I talk about early specialization, I'm talking about athletes perhaps in the under 11 and 13 and even the under 15 age group, really specializing solely in endurance at a young age. And the key thing for me then is the eggs in the basket. So we're putting a lot of eggs in one basket early on. Okay, so that then can maybe limit certain people coming into the event group, sort of late developers, etc. And I think we know from a lot of evidence out there now that there's quite a low conversion of high performing junior athletes to senior level. I think that's a well-known fact. There's a lot of evidence out there around that. I think it's about, as endurance coaches, I think we need to develop not just runners, but we want to develop athletes. So athletes who have low injury resistance and good all-round athleticism, and examples of that really at the top end of our sport are athletes like Jake Whiteman and Laura Waitman, and what those guys can do in the gym and the way they move is a sight to behold. So we don't want to limit our athletes' potential to those qualities later on. So with that in mind, just want to present a little bit to begin with about a long-term athlete development model. So this model was developed by Dr. John Oliver and Rodri Lloyd at Cardiff Met University. And I think this kind of sums up really that reason about why we should be a bit cautious with that early specialization and the qualities we want to continue to develop within our younger athletes. So I think this model shows quite nicely that there's a lot of movement, strength, speed qualities we want to develop in our athletes, and actually endurance development can actually, if we're doing that too early and we're missing out some of these qualities, we could be limiting the potential of our athletes. So that's the male model, and there's a female model as well, and that sort of shows just the female athletes just developing often on average that a little bit earlier. But I say that's yeah, just a little bit earlier. Okay, so who are we going to talk about today? So this is the pyramid that is often seen when you go on UK athletics courses. So it talks about the foundation fundamentals, so very much a run, jump, throw approach early on, and multi-sport, multi-event. And then you've got athletes then who are ready to start specialising in that event group stage. So these are the athletes that we're going to start discussing today. And who are they essentially? Who are these athletes and what do they tend to look like? So for me, and again, this is more around where I feel specialisation should start to happen. So these athletes are circa around year 9 or year 10 in school, and they're around about 14, 15 years of age. But that can obviously vary chronologically and biologically, so we need to be aware of that when we think about who's ready to specialise in an event group. These athletes are in the middle to maybe the end of puberty, depending on when they've started to go through that process. So there's been quite a lot of body changes. Okay, so the girls may have put a little bit of fat mass on. Both girls and boys would have longer limbs. They may have more difficulty controlling. So it's a kind of tricky period for athletes in their lives. And the physiology of the athletes at this time is actually evolving to that of an adult. So we can start to do a bit more specific training of that physiology. This type of athlete will still compete across a broad range of endurance events, which we want to encourage. They may also do a little bit of multi-event as well, and that's again a bonus, which I'll discuss a bit later on. And also, it's the start of their social awareness and emotional development as well, and also school pressures, etc. So I think that's another caveat that we need to be aware of when we're dealing with an event group athlete. So yeah, setting the scene, this sort of athlete will probably be an athlete who would come onto our regional development program within Welsh Athletics. So yeah, I think this is a broad subject, junior development, junior athlete development, and what we're going to focus on, like I said today, is the fundamentals. So this early event group athlete who's coming into our event group. Okay, so key training priorities within this area. So again, physical preparation, absolutely key. And I'll go through these in a little bit more detail as we move through the presentation. And we're revisiting potentially or building on the basics. We're starting to develop an aerobic engine. Okay, that's a priority with any endurance event. We're keeping an element of multis, so I still kind of want my athletes to be doing a little bit of hurdles. We wonder why we haven't got any steeplechasers within Wales. Or we struggle sometimes to develop steeplechasers, and I think some of that is around perhaps having the skills to go over hurdles. Developing speed, again, absolutely essential. Technical model then is also something that we need to coach. Gradually increasing training volume and structure. So this type of athlete over a period of a few years may then build. They may already be ready to start, but you'd want to build them sort of 4 to 5 weeks to train. 4 to 5 weeks at times a week of training. Then you've got a broad competition program, so you don't want them just specialising at the moment in one event. And also the broad education on lifestyle, long-term athlete development and psychobehavioural development. So I'm just going to touch upon these as we move through the presentation. So the key message, if you take anything from today, is I want you to think about giving your young endurance athletes solid foundations. So we're at the stage, they're just entering this event group stage, and we want to give these guys as solid a foundation in the event as possible. Okay, and how do we do that? So all the qualities I was saying about trying to develop, we need to develop them around the athletes. So it's a very much athlete-centered approach based on the individual athlete and trying to develop these qualities, as I said, around them. So I want to touch on first, but I haven't really got much time within this presentation to do this, but touch on the psychobehavioural and lifestyle, which I talked about in those priority areas. And this is basically a webinar in itself, really. So I think the main thing for me today is to signpost, to emphasise the importance of this area within any developing athlete. But like I said, beyond the realms of this presentation today, and there's some good webinars coming up around sort of things like nutrition, also ways that parents and families can support young athletes, and this kind of talking about this psychobehavioural and also lifestyle development is actually at the heart now of what we're trying to do at regional and national level, because we understand the importance of how this can influence athletes staying in the sport. Okay, so other two factors I want to touch upon now in terms of the fundamentals of that junior endurance athlete, so that event group athlete. We're going to touch upon the running elements first. So the speed and power development, but also the aerobic development. So aerobic development first and foremost. Why? To me, it's a little bit of a no-brainer. Probably don't really need to explain this too much, but obviously the aerobic system underpins most of the events that we actually do in endurance, and even 800 meters has a 60% aerobic component. And we do know that a high VO2 max, being able to sustain a high VO2 max for a long period of time, and also good running economy, so being able to use oxygen well and not spend too much energy when we're running, are key determinants of performance in endurance. So yeah, definitely an area that we need to focus on with our developing athletes. Okay, so how? And I think the key thing around developing the aerobic system is intensity, so controlling intensity and also volume as well. And I think using a training zone model, and again, Dan goes into this, Dan Nash, in a huge amount of detail in his physiology of endurance running webinar. So I won't be going to that level of detail this evening, but I think the key thing about these training models, the training zone model, is they do give you certain parameters around that controlling that intensity, and also what adaptations you might want to see as well. So I think it's well known within endurance development that working below the first threshold and above the second threshold, so that lactic turn point, give you good adaptations. And then that polarized approach with the volume below, a large amount of volume below the lactic threshold, and a peppering of volume around your 15–20% above that lactic turn point, gives you good return in terms of the aerobic, building the aerobic system. So just touching on this 6-zone model and what that kind of can look like. And I think the key thing around, as I said, is around intensity control when you're developing the aerobic system. And I think with young athletes, it's getting them to start to feel what that intensity is like. So rather than jumping in and giving them percentages of heart rate max or going too strong on pace, I think it's useful for them to start to feel how stressful sessions are, and also breathing reference can be quite useful as well. So where do we go with developing the aerobic system in young athletes? So as I said, you get most return in terms of endurance training below the first threshold and above the second threshold, with most of the volume, like I said, being in those zone 1 and zone 2, so those kind of easy zones. So we obviously need to start developing our young athletes in that area. And then also as well, we need to start working above that second threshold, so that lactic turn point as well. So obviously developing zone 1 and 2, very, very important. When we're above that turn point, obviously we've got options in zone 4 and zone 5. And I'll go on to why in a second, why zone 5 is actually a better zone for young athletes. And it's not that we should ignore tempo zone, and it's not an area that older athletes might want to develop into, but certainly from a bang for your buck and developing the right mechanics, zone 5, so working around that VO2 max is probably essential, is essential in junior athletes. Okay, so zone 1 and 2. So again, you want to be gradually building volume and building training load in this zone, because this is going to be where, if you're an endurance athlete and you're progressing through the system, this is going to be where the bulk of your volume is. So we should be starting our junior athletes to start to get used to the training intensity of this zone. And the key around that is teaching pace judgment, because even as athletes progress through the system, and even as high as senior athletes, struggle to get this zone right. And this zone is very important because it helps to develop that fatigue resistance and fat utilization, and also sort of shift those thresholds that we talked about at the start. So yeah, technical model is absolutely key at this stage as well. So if you've got athletes who are running quite sloppy at these zones, again, they're probably going to be limiting their economy, and also again, as I'll talk about later on, practice does make perfect with the technical model. So what are the parameters around these zones? What would the parameters look like for a junior athlete? So duration would be looking at around 20 to 60 minutes. It's quite a broad zone, and that will depend on who your individual athlete is. Some athletes will be able to take on a bit more volume earlier on. Some athletes will need to build. Okay, so it's important not to jump into very high volume in this zone, but you do need to start building it. So from an RPE point of view, so I've used rate of perceived exertion, and that is no exertion at rest almost, and then 10 being your maximal exertion. And that can be a nice way for young athletes to start to kind of get a feel for how hard they're working. Also talk tests, so can they hold a conversation? And then some older athletes, you might want to start progressing to percentages of their heart rate max, so they're using their heart rate to control. But as I said, I think this is something that you need to build towards, because the athlete needs to get an idea, first of all, how that session feels. Okay, so building then around, you can build those sessions around zone 5. So if you want to start increasing that volume, you can start to build that then around your sort of zone 5 sessions, which we'll touch upon shortly. Vary the surface and terrain because it helps with the impact, but also, an undulating loop of a zone 1 or 2 run can help with building muscular endurance. And you can, in all athletes, but certainly in younger athletes who are perhaps going through the stages of development, you might want to use a cross-training method to kind of build the tolerance in this zone. And this can be things like cycling, a cross trainer, as long as, again, they're working at a very easy level. Okay, so zone 5. So this is, as I said, a zone which is above the lactate turn point, and you're looking to maximally stress the aerobic system, because this helps to develop the heart and muscle function and improves the ability of oxygen to be carried around the body and used by the muscles. And again, just a debate around zone 4 and zone 5 for younger athletes is younger athletes usually struggle to maintain their technical model over a long period. And in zone 4, you often need quite a lot of volume to get the adaptations that you want. So younger athletes usually maintain a better technical model whilst stressing the aerobic system in zone 5. So I think that's something, technical model, as I'll keep harping on about, is absolutely vital in this age group. Okay, so again, some session parameters. So you're looking at quite a short duration. It's not a huge amount of work in this zone because it's quite a stressful zone. So you're looking 10 to 15 minutes max around a grass or undulating loop. RPE is quite high. So again, that RPE, so 0 to 10 scale, which I talked about, which is quite a good way of getting young athletes to kind of modulate their intensity. It's quite a high RPE. And also on a talk test, they shouldn't be able to say too much. Okay, rep duration then, it can be looking at sustained reps, so sort of between 2 and 4 minutes, which I know Dan touches upon within his webinar. So that's kind of roughly the length of rep that you want. But these, for younger athletes who will struggle to maintain, again, a good technical model, these can be broken down into shorter reps as well. And again, recovery, so you're looking at equal effort of recovery if you're doing active recovery, or slightly less if passive. And pace should be pretty consistent throughout the session. Pacing tables can help on the track. So by pacing tables, there's things like the Daniels tables, but you can also make up your own pacing table. So VO2 max is roughly around what we would call 3K pace. So if you're working slightly above or below that, you can set some paces around it. So, but what I will say is the pace should be pretty consistent throughout the session. So when athletes starting to get slower as the session progresses, they've probably gone off a bit too hard. And I think it's important that you coach that in a young athlete, because if they're not getting the intensity control at this age and they're working too anaerobically, too hard, they're going to struggle when, I said, the volume goes up a little bit later on. Okay, some session 5 examples there. They're pretty obvious to see on the screen. Again, off track, so if you're doing this kind of work off track, so around a grassy loop or some kind of parkland is quite good. So undulating loops, where that kind of helps the athlete moderate their intensity a little bit as well. And then on track, again, you can break that up into sort of shorter repetitions. So you're kind of still keeping the volume there, and you're probably still getting the amount of time within that that VO2 max area. But it's broken down, and as again I said, the key for that is that the athlete is able to then maintain a really, really good technical model whilst stressing that aerobic system. And a session at the bottom there is where athletes start around their 5K pace and maybe drop then to sort of a 1500 meter pace. So athletes quite like that sort of session because it just gets progressively quicker, and you're really, really driving then the mechanics of their running at the same time. Okay, so I said at the start about building the aerobic system and ensuring that you get the right volume and also the right intensity. I think the key thing around that is getting the balance right, because what we want to start to develop is a really strong aerobic system. And doing too much work, perhaps anaerobically at this age, or even at any age, can actually blunt that a little bit. So we want to try and get that balance right. This is what we want to try and see in our young athlete, in athletes, endurance athletes generally, is we want to try and build quite strong aerobic foundations. So often an athlete who hasn't done the right aerobic development, it's usually because everything's a bit too fast. Easy runs are too fast, harder sessions are then all out. Over to your sort of large aerobic foundation where the athlete's got quite good intensity. They're able to cope with a bit more volume because they've got good intensity control, and it just gives that athlete somewhere to go. Okay, because that profile on the left, the small aerobic foundations, that might suit an 800 meter athlete who's got a very huge speed reserve, but it isn't going to suit an athlete when the distances go up over cross country and even 1500 meters and above, really. So yeah, give your athletes a good base and start to develop those key components of the aerobic system in this fundamental stage of the endurance event group. Okay, we want to touch now upon speed and power development, because that's another component, and this is essentially a bit off the scale in terms of the aerobic system. So we're working way above that VO2 max, above that VO2 max. And kind of why do we want to develop the maximum speed? So when I talk about speed in younger athletes or younger endurance athletes, what I would be looking at is to develop the maximum speed. So I've talked about developing the base, this broad aerobic base, and actually now we want to raise the ceiling a bit. So we want to give our athletes, even our athletes who don't see themselves as sprinters, just giving them that kind of as maximum speed, or develop the speed as much as we possibly can. And going back to the youth athlete development model, again, we're at a key age in this event group stage or early event group stage to develop those qualities. Your athlete's going to be quite skill hungry for those for speed, for power, for strength. They go through a growth spurt where they'll be getting stronger as well. So I think this is the time to start developing that, and often this is something which is missed out further up the line, where athletes then struggle to finish quick in races. So having that other gear. So again, so going back to why, so good time to develop. Also, being able to sprint and being able to run fast actually does aid running economy at slower speeds. So running fast develops good stiffness, good reactivity, good ground contact. Okay, and that's something the sprinters are excellent at, or have to be excellent at, and that can actually help you run in economy then at slower speeds. So develop the speed reserve. We talk a lot about the speed reserve now, the anaerobic speed reserve. Well, the ceiling of that is maximum speed development. So we need to kind of get that as a baseline in our athletes. Okay, teach your athletes how to sprint, as I said. Teach them the mechanics of sprinting. And if you want a really good resource for that, Athletics 365 is an excellent place to go. And it's a good place to start. It's very progressive. So if your athlete isn't used to this type of training, it's a very good place to go. And just some session examples then around that. So obviously at the bottom, we've got more sort of maybe some more track specific sprints. So again, we're working the system here, which is again above oxygen. So the alactic system. So we're not really, and it's not really anaerobic either. So we're looking at that phosphocreatine system. So we're working at short efforts and quite maximal efforts as well. And then that can also be developed through hills. So we're not talking hills of 45-second plus duration. We're talking short, sharp hills, which encourage that power development. So just want to touch very briefly on speed endurance, because this is this again is a concept that is very commonly used within endurance running, and obviously speed endurance is a big component of your 800 meters, your 1500 meter type races. And you need to train at race pace to run at race pace. But what I would ask in this sort of session, which maximally is going to stress the anaerobic system, is you're developing endurance athlete ready. Is it more preferable to develop the aerobic base in this level of athlete, and not get this over dominant anaerobic system? But as I said, athletes kind of quite like these sessions, and a sprinkling of these near competition phase, I would say, is enough at this age group. Again, I've got some session examples there at the bottom. But again, this is a common thing that you tend to see is athletes training at 800 meter type speeds at a young age. And as I said, that triangle I showed on the left, the aerobic development gets quite blunted by doing quite a lot of work in this area. So we do need to, yes, use a little bit of it, but also develop the aerobic system preferentially at this point. Okay, so just in key points, a summary then, just about the running side of things. So build the volume in zones 1 and 2. So easy running. So get your athletes controlling the intensity. If they can do this right, it'll set them up for taking on more volume as they go through the system. Maximally stress the aerobic system with a good technical model. So again, we talked about zone 4 versus zone 5 in this early stage event group athlete. Zone 5 is I would say is more your go-to area, as I said, because you're developing the right mechanics. A pepper in the speed endurance, so very little of this, if I'm honest. and then you're looking to develop that maximal speed. So raise the ceiling, so build the base, raise the roof. Okay, athlete-centered approach. So we're looking now back at our model of our athlete-centered approach. And I think then one of the areas that perhaps gets a bit left behind maybe within endurance is physical prep. You do need to do running to get better at running, but physical prep plays an absolutely integral role in that athlete's development. Okay, so the reason for that is you've built this nice aerobic engine. What do you want to put it in? Do you want to, what's the body of that car, that person look like? Okay, is it a Porsche or is it a rusty Cadillac? So is that engine going to be able to be used to its full effect? Okay, and that's where the chassis or the structure comes in huge importance. Okay, as a runner, you're looking at absorbing and releasing forces, or absorbing and utilizing forces of 8 times your body weight. So effective storage and release of energy will help to reduce the cost of energy cost of running. So that stiffness, that reactivity will help with that. And also then you're looking to minimize injury risk. You're taking on a huge amount of training. If you're a marathon runner, you're going to be possibly training up to 120 miles a week in the future. So you want to put the things in place now to help that athlete minimize their injury risk as well. Okay, so what can we do? So we can start to physically prepare athletes to cope with those forces, and also we can try and optimize running form as well. Okay, so what does physical preparation look like? So physical preparation for any athlete has a similar structure. So and it's all underpinned by this bottom layer, this athletic motor skill competencies. And that's one thing, when we're in this fundamental stage of developing an endurance athlete, we need to really think about, is my athlete competent at these more basic skills before we start putting on the more sexy stuff, for want of a better word, sort of developing the ability to produce force and the sport specific stuff. Actually, can our athletes do the basics? So these were a few questions I'd ask, certainly around an event group level or an athlete who's going into that fundamental level, so fundamental stage of the event group, is how does your athlete move through the basic fundamental movements? So can they squat, can they lunge, can they hinge? Because again, before you add load to those movements, they need to be good movement. Can your athletes complete single leg balance tasks? And Athletics 365 is quite a good resource again to go back to look at that. Does your athlete have good trunk, calf and hamstring endurance? So capacity. So for example, with a calf, we'd look at an athlete being able to do at least 20 to 30 single leg calf raises as a marker of a good capacity. And if they can't, some of those, that's going to perhaps limit them as they're running over a long period of time, and perhaps putting them at risk of a bit more risk of injury as well. How do they rate on range of movement tests? And also, can your athlete take off and land 2-footed or 1-footed? So that's again key for me, because for running is a single leg activity, and also your athletes taking off and landing almost each step. So can they land that? Have they got stability there? And are they absorbing the force well? So there's one of my athletes who's actually in a multi-event athlete, Ellen. She does pole vaults, but she also dabbles in endurance, but also within, she does some of the long sprints as well. So she spends part of the time with me and part of the time with Ed Thompson. Okay, so just some resources again. So it's quite a busy screen, but these resources are from the Welsh Athletics Physical Preparation booklet, and they're ways in which to assess those qualities in your athletes. And the other way, like I said, is Athletics 365. So do go to those two resources because they will help you start to work out what your athlete's strengths and weaknesses are in terms of physical prep. Okay, some session ideas then. So what do these sessions look like? Again, I go back to multi-events and not being too rigid with your athletes. Again, if we want to develop hurdlers, we want to develop good movement, multi-events is almost does that without even thinking about it. Okay, you've then got your general movement and conditioning circuits, so trying to develop really good movement whilst perhaps getting some aerobic conditioning of the muscles. Your ABCs, so can your athlete do the ABCs, so agility, balance, coordination? Can they stand on one leg? Can they hopscotch? Those sort of things, because I know they're things that athletes see as being more things they should have done in childhood, but often we're seeing that athletes haven't got those basic competencies when they enter this event group stage. Again, mobility, if you've got any restrictions which you might have found on some range of movement assessments, what can you do around that? In terms of general movement and conditioning circuits, we'll work on that, and also things like foam rolling and some soft tissue release. Warm-ups, absolutely key for me, because if you don't see your athlete that often, when are you going to do S&C? Integrating these kind of things into your warm-ups will be really helpful, and will just be very time efficient as well. And then you've got your more reactivity and stiffness type work, which is around your drills and your basic plyo. So drills are also good for developing the movement patterns you want from when you're running, and you're priming that neuromuscular system to get ready for running. Okay, it's just a few session examples here, so you're not listening to me talking all the time around some of the stuff I would do with my athletes. So we've got this movement and conditioning circuit. So we've got athletes doing just general movements around the core, some calf raises, some squats, and again, Ellen's quite proficient, so she's able to add a little bit of weight to that. Basic movement patterns, so crawling, and big animal walks. Again, they're not just for kids. Finn Corcoran, who does a lot of the S&C with a lot of the senior endurance athletes, was telling me he uses those with our top level sort of Commonwealth Games program athletes in Wales. So you've got things like your mountain climbers, and also again basic movement patterns in your lunge. Okay, and again, as I said, I like to get the athletes I coach strong and stable on their one leg, because I said running is very much moving from one leg to the other, and you need to be strong and stable. Let's go back. See if I can start the video. Okay, so you've got some more exercises more in a lying position, where you're taxing the one leg more than the other. Then you're building that into more balance. So athletes being able to do single leg balance. So can they stand on one leg, as I said before? Standing then in a running position on one leg. Some balance then with movement. So you're challenging that balance with a bit more movement. And then you've got single leg balance with a task. So you're having to think a little bit more what you're doing, and not think so much about your balance or fix too much. And then you can build that up then to doing more single leg sort of weighted exercises. So again, keeping the weight fairly light at the moment, and then more dynamic single leg activities. So some leg switches, which Amy demonstrates very well. And then just being able to hop and stick. Okay, so those are the types of things I might do from developing that unilateral, so single leg work. Okay, technical model of running. Okay, so we built, so by the physical prep, we're building the robustness and the strength to be able to cope with the load that we take as an endurance athlete. And then you've got this, the running model. So running is essentially a movement pattern, and it's controlled by the central and peripheral nervous system. It's an innate movement. It's like walking. If somebody asks you how you walk, you probably won't be able to tell them, but you do it, and it's something you've learned very much from a young age. Then what I would say about running, because it's a skill, and again, essentially with a skill, practice makes perfect. We need to make sure we're running well at all speeds. So if the technical model is breaking down, then you might need to either stop the session or try and modify that session. Yeah, because I say if you start to learn a bad skill, it'll stick with you. Okay, so what is the endurance running technical model? What's the optimal technical model? And I think the jury's a little bit out on this, especially as you go further up the distances. The kind of the models that people run in can be quite different. You've got a sprinter on the left-hand side, so teaching your athletes, as I said, to sprint is quite a uniform way of moving, and those athletes need to land very close to the centre of mass. They need to produce a lot of force in a short period of time and very quick ground contact. And then I say you've got an endurance athlete then who's going to be running at those slower speeds. So just some key pointers though, because I say there's not the jury's a little bit out on exactly what the optimal technical model is of endurance, but I think with our young athletes we need to start coaching this a little bit more. We need to get that fundamental movement in place, So there's one of my athletes, like Coach Morgan, and just giving you some pointers there around what things we should start to look for. So there should be quite a tall posture, so we shouldn't be sinking too much at the top part of our chest or at our hips. And there's that slight forward lean, which is going to help you with momentum and efficiency. And that foot, as with sprinters, shouldn't be landing too far in front of us. If it's landing too far in front, you're probably likely to be then applying braking forces. So the heel's likely to land first with the toes up, which is not, again, the athlete's probably likely to more overstride. Again, as with the sprinters, you probably want more of this, again, this neutral foot strike, and it's a stiff ankle, a rigid, stiff ankle to react off. And then over to the other side, then it's basically looking at the extension. But for athletes, we try and push, and we get told to push triple extension in athletes as you need for events where you take like sort of high jump, where you're taking off and you're going vertical. Actually, for our athletes, we don't want to push that as much, and it's been shown actually to reduce running economy if there's too much a triple extension. So yeah, I think that's just a broad overview of the technical model of endurance. And I think if you want more information, I've attached to the resources at the end of the presentation some good good resources you can go away and look at around this the technical model of endurance running. Okay, so how can we optimize it? So I've talked about making sure that we've got the kind of strength and the stability and the physical qualities in place. Drills, as I said, can help to prime the neuromuscular system and get you used to doing patterns of movement associated with running. Practice makes perfect, as I've said already. And then we've got this coaching element to it. So can we coach this? And what have we got at our disposal to coach running action? So again, what we need to see then is cues and feedback. So you can, one of the things we often say to runners is think about how you run. And as I said, running is a very innate movement pattern. So there's not, intrinsic cueing often doesn't work. Thinking about it too much doesn't work very well. And it can end up in arms and legs going all over the place. So external cues can often be helpful. So giving a external command or verbal cue to your athlete. So again, if they're dropping it, flexing the hips, say hips up, or don't let your hips drop. Body's too upright, again, drop your chest forward or drift or slightly fall forward. Yeah. And then around then we're looking at sort of environmental cues. So you're looking at more external cues in the environment, which may help to help promote good movement patterns. So you could be looking at working, if you find your athletes overstriding a little bit, you could start to use mini hurdles to kind of increase that cadence. Skipping ropes are quite good if you've got an athlete who's quite doesn't react very well off the ground. Skipping rope and practicing skipping can help with that. And then you can use things like video analysis as well. And video analysis can like get your athlete to see a little bit about how they move, and you can also monitor if there's been any changes as well. Okay, just before we start to wrap up, I wanted to talk a little bit about competition structure, because I think this has a massive influence on athletes at this age. So what does a competition program look like for this event group endurance athlete? So these guys are starting to move from maybe a train to train phase into a more train to compete stage. But I think the key, and this is often sometimes that we see, it is a very huge performance focus, endurance at a young age. And I think that can be quite negative for young athletes, and it can be their only focus at a time where actually they're going through quite a lot of change, and performances may start to plateau a little bit. So I think if you think around that, minimizing over races, get these guys still competing across a range of endurance distance. So nobody really should be an 800-meter runner solely at 14. And also that competing in some of the sprint events and longer sprints can also be something that athletes enjoy and will help develop their endurance and their endurance capabilities later on. The events really need to be fun and relevant at this age, so they need to be going to events that they feel a benefit in them, but also that they're enjoying. So it's still all about making sure that it's fun. And a gradual exposure to international competitions. This sort of athlete may be getting to the stage where they might be eligible for schools, international, etc. But I think it shouldn't all be about the Welsh Vest. It shouldn't just be about you know, that performance focus. And But it is quite good for your athlete at this stage to start getting some exposure to GB-wide competition. So perhaps, you know, they'll have potential to go to, say, a British Intercounties or to the Liverpool Cross Challenge, and those kind of events will help to develop that athlete in terms of their wider capabilities and also kind of what they're up against outside of Wales as well. So I think it's important to start introducing that, but it will depend on the athlete and whether they're ready for it. So it's just, again, that's more of a coach decision, I suppose. And again, developing tactical awareness, and I haven't touched upon this earlier on, it's good to start developing this in our athletes, and competitions are one way of doing this, keeping not just a focus on running timed races or races where athletes have been taken around in a certain lap or paced. It's very good for them to learn the craft at this age, as it is at any age, but it starts the foundations for that. But you can also look as well to bring in sort of tactical sort of training sessions as well. So group time trials are quite good for this. So they have to start on a curve in a lane start, and they just get used to that build up, and they're running around in groups. Or you can just get some sessions which start to kind of, you know, maybe some wind up sessions where you start to get a little bit faster. So again, I've got 1500 example, or again in that kind of 800 meter bracket, you might want to sort of start the first rep a bit quicker and then get the last rep quick as well, which kind of mimics what you might see more in an 800. So yeah, you can start to develop this in your athletes, and they quite like these sort of sessions. You know, it's a little bit different to perhaps the more physiological training. Yeah, and I think it's something that, you know, certainly as athletes move through the age groups, they have to go through rounds, etc. This is integral skill that they'll need. Okay, putting that together then within a training week. These are quite two busy slides. So we've got an example winter training week and an example summer training week. So I'm not going to go through every aspect of this slide because some of it I've already talked about, but it's just giving you a bit of an idea around training structure. And I think the key thing to get across is if you're starting to develop running volume in this athlete, that most of as you can see, most of that running is in those zone 1s and 2s area. Also then S&C has a big flavour still throughout this programme, so you don't ignore S&C. It's something that gets actually integrated into the programme, and like I said, from what I've shown there, you can integrate that into warm-ups quite easily. So just doing some basic 10-15 minutes prior to a session of, you know, as I got there, mini plyos and drills, and then again with the Friday session, then you could do some more functional movement skills, so you get your athletes doing squats, lunges, as they move through their warm-up. Okay, and I think the key thing, other thing to say about this type of training example is that on with the harder sessions, so when you've got a zone 5 or zone 6 session, is giving your athlete a little bit of recovery between those sessions. So I quite like the model, and I think it gives ample recovery of a Tuesday Friday session or a Monday Thursday session. And like I say, I think athletes at this age, they only need 2 hard sessions. If you're giving them a lot of hard work and they're not developing that base, that volume, then they're possibly going to struggle later on. So you don't want to limit the potential of where they can go in any event at the moment. And like I said, I think it's just getting that training balance right at this age. And again, going on to summer, there's not too much difference other than the volume will probably drop in the summer because obviously there's a lot more racing. And I think from the track sessions, then you can start to build in. You want to still keep that zone 5 flavour in your track sessions, although you can start dipping into that kind of 1500 metre pace, etc., or finishing with some faster reps. But I think also then looking at tactical sessions, but I say still at this point in the year or leading up to this point, this summer area is not hammering that speed endurance, not hammering those really specific 800 metre sessions, or which are really going to be looking at developing a huge anaerobic component. I'm not saying there's not a place to bring those in later on, but we want to preferentially be looking at that balance of in favour of the aerobic system at this younger age. Okay, finishing off, I want to talk a little bit about, and this is the final couple of slides for those of you hanging on. This is talk about a little bit the reality of our sport and the retention, which I touched upon at the start. And I think there's some stats on the screen which I don't have to read out for you, but basically the impact of dropout is highest probably at this under 17, under 20 age group. And our stats on female athletes in Wales and retention is not the best. And when I started working with Welsh Athletics, I did do a bit of a desktop analysis of perhaps where our 2018 female endurance athletes were, because we obviously didn't fill every event. And actually it showed that I looked at under 15s between 2007 to 2011 who would now be our our senior athletes. And actually it was quite stark that 77% of those under 15s were no longer competing at all in athletics. So they'd left the sport. And the other sobering fact that I found as well was actually over half of the 2007 to 2011 under 15 endurance athletes in the female bracket had their best performance under 15. So there'd been a huge performance focus early on. They then peaked. They hadn't had the right tools in place to kind of move through the system, and sadly, again, went on to leave the sport. So, I think those figures from a performance point of view are quite sobering, because that's like where our next athlete's going to come from. But also we have a duty of care to athletes as well, to keep them in sport, keep them healthy, keep them fit. And say, coming from a background in healthcare, having people who have a lifelong love of sport is very important, and exercise. So yeah, I think we've got kind of two facets to that retention. Okay, so touching on why they disengage and why I've talked so much about these fundamental qualities we want to develop in young endurance athletes. So why do they disengage? Well, the top reasons, as I touched upon at the start, often are more psychobehavioral, psychosocial, lifestyle issues. So more around time constraints, etc., for studying, hobbies, other interests. But below that, injury and performance wasn't improving. So, again, if we're not developing the right competition program, we're pushing athletes quite young to take on too much intensity, too much load, and we're not giving them the tools to be able to cope with that. There's a potential that they're going to leave sport. And again, for 30% of athletes who are to leave the sport because of injury is actually, yeah, for me that was quite sobering. So finally, just to wrap up, what can we do as endurance coaches? So as I said, this fundamental stage is about, and I go back to building a solid base. Okay, so it's building a strong and robust athlete through continued physical prep, getting the basics right in terms of physical prep. Aerobic development, I said aerobic development over anaerobic development should be the absolute priority in terms of that physiology at this age. And because you're giving your athletes somewhere to go. And I go back to those triangles. If you can develop a really strong base and you're getting the volume and the intensity right, then you just give your athletes somewhere to go, depending on whatever event they end up settling in. And you often see people go, well, he's an 800-meter runner, he doesn't have to do that much volume. Well, again, that early event specialization, calling somebody an 800-meter runner at a younger age, again, can be the limitation of where they can go as an athlete. Training variety, extremely important. Make your sessions fun, make them varied, make sure the athletes are enjoying what they do, minimizing over racing and that outcome focus, because again, that key reason why athletes leave the sport is often around that performance focus. Well, my performance wasn't improving. And then again, acknowledging that support an athlete needs at this stage of life development. So again, don't ignore that. Again, it's become a key driver at the moment for us in Welsh Athletics to try and keep athletes in the sport and understand the reasons behind that, and that kind of psychosocial development is something that we need to be hugely aware of. Okay, some excellent resources. Well, I think they're excellent anyway. So I've touched on Athletics 365. You've got your Welsh Athletics YouTube channel, and during lockdown, there's been some really good stuff being uploaded on there. If you want to know about basic plyo exercises, general conditioning circuits, etc., there's heaps to see up there. You've got your physical prep booklets, Athletics Hub, and then I've just got some references down the bottom then around sort of the youth physical development model, which I've touched upon, and also some guys who are pretty well clued up in the technical model of running. So Tom Groom and Chris Brammer. So definitely take a look at some of these, because I learned a lot from them. Okay, thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate it. There's been a lot to get through in this webinar, even just around the basic level of these junior endurance athletes. But yeah, appreciate very much you taking the time to come here this evening and listen to me talking. So just have a little look now if there's any questions. So bear with me. Okay, so a question here from Gwendolyn Roberts around triathlon. And I think it's about, where do you think the balance is between developing young athletes and those who are interested in triathlon, as the triathlon scene is quite varied and widespread in Wales and very popular. I think, again, triathlon is quite complements endurance running quite well. And I talked about that cross-training element, which when you're developing the kind of base and you're developing volume, actually cross-training can be quite a good medium. We've actually got a couple of triathletes who compete well on the track, one of them being Osian Perrin, who last year broke the Welsh record under 17. And Osian has an excellent aerobic base from doing triathlon, and it's not something we want to kind of limit at the moment with an athlete like that who has obviously got potential in two sports, even up to the point where there's somebody like Alex Yee who's competing well at triathlon, you know, up to senior level, but also it's got GB vests on the track as well. So yeah, for sure, I think keeping that balance between the two is not a bad thing, and they often complement each other as well. What I would say is if athletes are then going to go to the sort of slightly shorter endurance distances, they probably do need to do a bit of speed work, and they do need to start developing the maximal speed. This is important. If that's being developed in their triathlon program, great, but they are going to be a bit more limited in what event they can go to later on if they haven't got that speed reserve there. Okay, just looking around some more questions. Should athletes do a base phase every year? How long should it be for, and what sorry, this is from Gareth. And how long should it be for, and what intensity? Is it just zone? So again, when we talk about developing the volume, that's what we're trying to do in zones 1 and 2. So if you're trying to develop you know, volume, the majority of volume is going to be in zones 1 and 2, and that should have a flavour throughout the year, and especially in a young athlete, because you don't want to periodize them too much at this age, I wouldn't say. So yeah, I think you know, that zone 1 and 2 can be used throughout basically, and you want to just try and gradually build that volume up over the years. So an example of one of the athletes I coach, I've started to develop that zone 1 and 2 since the age of, let's say, 14, 15, and you know, he's now a 20-year-old, and he's running sort of 60, 70 miles a week. So it's kind of taken that athletes to that stage. So it's and a lot of that has been developed through gradual increase in that zone 2. Yeah, it's that zone 1 and 2 over a period of many years. So it takes time to develop the volume, but as we know, volume is a big predictor of endurance performance, and athletes are often on quite a lot of volume as they get to the latter stages of their, you know, of their development. So yeah, it's something that we need to keep throughout the program for a junior athlete. Okay, I'm aware of the time, so I do apologise that we're probably going to have to stop here. If there's any questions I haven't answered, then I will do my best to answer them and get in contact with you. But yeah, again, appreciate you listening this evening, and if there's any questions, please feel free to, or anything you want to sort of qualify from this presentation, just give me a drop me an email, and I can get in touch. Okay, many thanks. There's lots of new good webinars coming up as well, so keep in touch, stay in touch, and stay involved.